Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. Today I am back talking about Astoria, Queens, which, is a neighborhood of New York City where I live. Today I want to focus on some stories about tunnels, smugglers' tunnels perhaps, other sorts of tunnels, haunted tunnels, etc. in Astoria. This is part of kind of my look at ghosts in Astoria and ghost stories in Astoria. And I mentioned this last episode, I've mentioned this in many episodes. I like to look at not just stories about hauntings and ghosts, but also stories about things that kind of, quote, should have led to hauntings and ghosts, right? It's said that a lot of times hauntings are caused by, like something psychically scarring, something bad that happened somewhere, something that may have caused someone to die and perhaps have unfinished business, etc. And so one thing I've been doing as I've been doing my deep dive into haunted areas of Astoria and ghosts of Astoria is I'm also looking at things that feel like they should have led to hauntings and ghosts and things that seemed very psychically scarring, but that perhaps haven't, or at least haven't to my knowledge. Next week, I'm going to talk more about probably some more sort of fun traditional ghost stories that I found in newspapers, but I really did a deep dive into these tunnels, pun intended, I guess, and I wanted to talk about that this week. So first off, I want to talk about Hallett's Cove, which, if you listen to the last episode, I talked a lot about the Hallett family last week. They were an old family in Astoria. There's a lot of stuff named after them. Hallett's Cove is on the Queens waterfront along the East River. If you stand at Hallett's Cove, as I do all the time, it seems, you can see Roosevelt Island, you can see the lighthouse at Roosevelt Island, and then you can see the Upper East Side of Manhattan, just across the river there. And you can also see the Hell Gate, which is a notoriously dangerous and supposedly haunted body of water right here off the coast of Queens. And I've done an episode about the Hell Gate, several episodes about the Hell Gate in the past, so if you haven't listened to those, you can check those out. And also, I did an episode about Socrates Sculpture Park, which is a park in the area right next to Hallett's Cove, which has a stone wall around it made of tombstones, and no one knows where those tombstones came from. Were they ever someone's real tombstones? Were they just cast-offs? No one knows. So that's also right by Hallett's Cove, and I did a whole episode about that park and the mysterious tombstones as well. So I was reading an old book about Long Island City, it's an area that encompasses Astoria. And I found some interesting stuff. So this book is called History of Long Island City, New York. It's by J.S. Kelsey, and it was published in 1896. And it talked about a possible smuggler's cave and a smuggler who supposedly haunts Hallett's Point, which is basically like Hallett's Cove curves up into Hallett's Point. So they're right next to each other. And for reference, Hallett's Point today has the Astoria houses, which is a NYCHA property. And there's also a ferry landing there. And I did some more digging, looking for more information about this possible smuggler's cave. And in a book called Old Roads from the Heart of New York, Journeys Today by Ways of Yesterday, within 30 miles around the Battery. Man, titles used to be really long back then. That's written by Sarah Comstock. And it talks about Jones Wood at first. And Jones Wood is part of the Upper East Side of Manhattan, right across the river from Astoria. It starts out talking about that, then talks about Astoria. So I'm just going to read from this. Two remarkable cousins, Samuel and David Provost, have passed into history. The former was the first bishop of New York and the president of Columbia College. But David was famed in a widely different way. He was one of the most daredevil smugglers known, and a rocky hole once existing on the shore of this wood, Jones Wood, was known as the Smuggler's Cave. Here, and in another cave across the river at Hallett's Point, he hid his treasure, and the boys of the early 1800s used to shiver and tell delicious, creepy stories of the old rascal whose ghost haunted these two black caverns. Not until he was 90 years old did David yield up his law-defying, rollicking, money-scattering career. So, I have been having trouble confirming whether there was any kind of smuggler's tunnel or cave at Hallett's Point for real, and I haven't found other mentions of ghost stories in that area, aside from, the stories of the smuggler. And I guess when I say that area, I mean literally Hallett's Point. Though I know that the reef at Hallett's Point was blown up in 1869, and tunnels were dug there, radiating underneath the reef and the river, and then basically they filled those tunnels with explosives and they were blown up. And that was to make the area more navigable for ships, since, as I've talked about in past episodes, the Hellgate was really treacherous. Tons of boats ran aground there. And I don't know if anyone died during that excavation, though I do think that, digging tunnels under a river and then exploding reefs in the river probably counts as trauma to the surrounding area, which is something that I look at, when it comes to hauntings and the paranormal. So that did happen in that area. I have been able to find more information about David Provost, though, this smuggler. So another book that I was looking at about the area talked about merchant and smuggler David Money-Ready Provost. So, he lived from 1691 to 1781, and to read a bit from that book, the 90-acre site, Louvre Farm, on the eastern side of Manhattan, was owned by the Provost family and had a cave where David hid his money. It was later said that David's ghost haunted the woods. So I guess, he haunted his smuggler's cave at Hallett's Point. He haunted the woods at Jones Woods. Why not? And I found a bit more in a book called A Loiterer in New York by Helen Weston Henderson, published in 1917. The bishop had a cousin, David Provost, a revolutionary soldier with a rare talent for smuggling, which won him the nickname of Ready Money Provost. He used to hide his booty in Smuggler's Cave on the shore of the bishop's farm, or in a cave at Hallett's Point, Astoria. So there's a lot of different sources that talk about this cave, and several mentions of his ghost, though I wish I could have found more ghost information. I did find some good cemetery intel, though, about the Provost Cemetery. So the family had a cemetery in Jones Wood, and there's this book called Old New York from the Battery to Bloomingdale, and it's written by a woman named Eliza Greatoreau, I think is how you say that. And it's sort of a nostalgic look at disappearing landmarks in New York City, and it was written in 1875. So it has a description of the area that was the Provost family cemetery. It sounds also like the Reicher and Lawrence families had properties there in Manhattan in what is now the Upper East Side, in addition to their Queens homesteads, which I've talked about in the past. I guess that makes sense. Rich people probably have a lot of land in the area. And then it mentions The Smuggler, this book. So I wanted to read from that. What walks and nutting expeditions the children remember into Jones Woods, whose long avenue opened to the south, and where they could visit the old tomb of the smuggler in the rocky and shady growth near the wood. But the city has destroyed the beauty of all that region. The Reicher House and Lawrence Homestead and the lively Arch Brook are hardly to be discerned, and have all long ago passed from the possession of the families who made them such charming homes for long, happy years. This has a lot of, sort of nostalgic, nice stuff to say about the Reichers, though I'll return to the Reichers later this episode, and I did talk about, their slave-owning history, both the Reichers and the Lawrences, last week, so, not all happy. So then the book describes the life of David Provost and closes with his death and what happened to his supposed tomb in this cemetery in Jones Wood. He died in 1781 at the age of 90 years, and his name was inscribed on the tomb where Johanna, his most loving wife, had long reposed. 3/4 of a century after his death, the tomb was opened, and in it were found 3 or 4 coffins. The lid of one of these measured over 7 feet, and a few vertebrae of a size which would correspond to a frame of such magnitude were near. A woman's skeleton and a child's were also discovered. Since then the tomb, or rather the place of the tomb, has been left open, empty and ruinous, but when we last saw it, October 1875, the hill remained, and the doorway, and enough of the original structure to identify it. So it's kind of interesting how the smuggler's cave, or, the smuggler who had a smuggler's cave on both sides of the river, his tomb became almost a cave, right? And there's some cool drawings of it that this woman did that show it, and it really does look like, a little man-made cave, all overgrown and very spooky looking. So I was looking into other possible tunnels, caves, etc. in the area of Astoria, and I was in particular looking for deaths related to tunnels, caves, etc. And I did find a tunnel under the East River called the Belmont Tunnel that had some worker deaths related to it. So I wanted to talk about that. So basically, in the 1890s, William Steinway of Steinway piano fame, whose company town was located in Astoria, wanted to build a tunnel under the East River for trolleys. And I believe that the 7 train uses that tunnel now. There was an article from January 17th, 1906 in the Los Angeles Herald, which was called "Four Lose Their Lives in Tunnel Disaster," that details some of the deaths that happened during the construction of this tunnel under the East River. So 2 workers died of suffocation and caisson disease, I think is how you say that. It's the bends, right? And 2 were drowned, and 2 other people were really badly injured. It sounds like all 4 of the workers who died were black, and there was a white foreman and assistant who were also injured. The accident was caused by a compressed air pipe which burst in the tunnel under the East River, underneath Man-O-War Reef, and that was even with 42nd Street in Manhattan. At the time that the article was written, the day after the accident, the 2 drowned men were still stuck underwater in the tunnel. And the tunnel's still there, and there's also an island above the tunnel. The landfill from the tunnel's construction became a little tiny island in the East River called Youthfant Island, which at 100 by 200 feet is the smallest island in Manhattan. It has a cool little metal structure on it, and it's closed to the public, and it's just a bird sanctuary now. There's a colony of cormorants who live there, though I'm very curious if there's any haunting type situations there. Although I say that, and that leads me to a question, which is, do hauntings exist if there aren't people to see them, right? Like, it's an island with no people on it. And I do know that fishermen go up towards the island and fish. I think there's a good bass fishing area right by that island. But yeah, if there's not people there, do hauntings exist? There's a lot of, different stuff that folks have written and talked about, kind of asking the question of whether ghosts are something that are kind of like constructed, like you see a ghost, someone else might look at the same thing and see something else or see nothing. Like, it's not necessarily kind of like if there's just a rock sitting there, you can look at it and you can be like, that's a rock. And another person could look at it and be like, that's a rock. And even if there wasn't a person there, that rock would still be there. But, yeah, on an island in the middle of the river with no people and just a bunch of cormorants, would there be a ghost or a haunting? I guess you could argue that in some people's homes that are haunted, animals, especially like cats and stuff, seem to be aware of hauntings and seem to see something that people can't see. So I don't know. If there's a ghost that birds can see, I guess the cormorants get along with it. But I know I'm getting off topic now. So enough of that digression. Let's get back to Astoria. So about a month ago, I was at Astoria Park, and I overheard a group of men, probably like in their 50s, maybe early 60s, talking about how supposedly we were right near an area that had tunnels that had been used by, the famous Underground Railroad conductor Harriet Tubman. I've done a lot of Google searching, etc., trying to confirm that over the last month, and I have not been able to confirm that. But my ears perked up when they said that, because we were less than a 10-minute walk away from Hallett's Cove, which, I was aware of the Smuggler's Cave there, and I was like, oh, I wonder if there's Smuggler's Tunnels there, or if that Smuggler's Cave could have been used as part of the Underground Railroad, if not by Harriet Tubman, maybe by someone else, etc. And in case you were wondering, I didn't ask these guys to elaborate because I had family visiting from out of town and I was hanging out with family, and I really don't think they wanted me to go approach some strangers and then ask them a bunch of questions about caverns and the history of the area. So I did a little bit of digging, trying to figure out how, like, what kinds of caves were used in the Underground Railroad, were tunnels often used, like, was this a thing? And, I'm not that knowledgeable about the Underground Railroad. I basically only know what I learned in school. But Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's, a very famous Black academic and writer, he wrote an article that was posted on PBS and The Root, debunking some myths about the Underground Railroad. And he said that there weren't as many tunnels that were used as part of the Underground Railroad as people seem to think there were. So to read a bit from his article, those tunnels or secret rooms in attics, garrets, cellars, or basements, not many, I'm afraid. Most fugitive slaves spirited themselves out of towns under the cover of darkness, not through tunnels, the construction of which would have been huge undertakings and quite costly. And few homes in the north had secret passageways or hidden rooms in which slaves could be concealed. However, that being said, if there was an existing smuggler's cave, it makes me wonder if that could have been used. And also, I wonder if, maybe there was a cave there that was used, by the smuggler, and then possibly for the Underground Railroad, maybe, maybe not. I just feel really skeptical about the Underground Railroad claim too, because the more I read about the history of Astoria, the more I see that, it was full of slave owners and people who were pretty pro-slavery. So I think that Queens would be a really risky place to hide people. I think people would be much, much better off in Manhattan or Brooklyn versus Astoria, just based on what I've read so far about this. But, there could have been some sort of cave or tunnel or something. But, the Army Corps of Engineers tunneled under the East River and detonated those bombs to clear out the treacherous parts of the Hell Gate. So that probably also collapsed any caves that were in the area. That would be my guess, at least. Though, side note, I will say that even though the Hell Gate has been, cleared of the major obstructions, etc., it is a weird place. And I know I've spent many episodes talking about this, but just the other night, my friend and I were in Astoria Park on a weeknight at 7, and I don't usually go to the park at that time. And we were just hanging out by the Hell Gate watching, and there were just tons of whirlpools. Some of them were small, some of them were several feet wide, and we were just watching, and there would be a tiny whirlpool. It would get bigger, it would disappear, then there'd be a big whirlpool, big meaning a couple feet wide, that would get, deeper and bigger and then disappear. There were just random whirlpools everywhere. The water, there's parts where it just looks totally flat, and then all around it there's water, running around it. It's just a weird spot. So even though things have been cleared, it's still an unusual place. So to get back to smugglers' tunnels, as I was working on this, I remembered that I read an article about the Reicher Smith homestead, which mentioned possible smugglers' tunnels there. And after digging through my extremely disorganized mess of sources that I used for that episode on the old Reicher homestead and cemetery, I found what I was looking for. There was a March 17th, 1968 article in the Long Island Press called "This House May Be Haunted." So, to read from that article, there are chains in the basement that were supposedly used to imprison slaves, said Mrs. Rika Smith with a shudder. And there's also a rumor that a hidden passage, once used for smuggling, runs from the ancient basement to the bay. So here's an instance where instead of, a basement and smugglers' tunnels being used for emancipation and, the Underground Railroad, this was the exact opposite, right? This was a slaveholding family, an enslaving family who probably were not so different from a lot of the old families of Astoria. So I remember at that time when I did that episode a few months ago, I was wondering why there were, a few offhanded mentions of slavery in the research I was doing, but not really any details about it. And to be honest, I read this article near the end of preparing my notes for the Reicher Smith Cemetery episodes, and I just didn't have time to follow up on them the way I would like to. But last week I started to remedy that. I talked about just some of the records of enslavers in Astoria, and of course the Reicher family was among them. And today I wanted to continue with that, because while I haven't been able to find more information about the smugglers' tunnels, I have found some really dark stuff about the Reicher family. So I should have said this before the last part of the episode, but content warning, I'm going to be talking about some really disturbing stuff regarding chattel slavery, including stories about free Black people in New York City being kidnapped and forced into slavery. So this is something that, as I was reading about it, I was like, wait a second, I've read the Wikipedia page for Rikers Island, which is, this terrible jail pretty close to where I live. I was like, I've read the Wikipedia page for Rikers Island a couple times. I do think I sort of read but skimmed over this part about the Reichers, who the island is named after. Just because I was really focused on the topic of the episodes, I was reading the Wikipedia article as part of my research for, and it just kind of I just kind of glossed over it. But I shouldn't have, because I was doing some more reading on John Jay College's website about slavery in New York City. And I learned something that I had no idea about regarding one of the Reichers of Newtown, Queens. And I do wonder if this is something that people raised in New York maybe learn in New York history in school. I'm not sure. I can't say, because I grew up in Texas and I had 2 years of Texas history. But aside from just, skimming over this in the Rikers Island Wikipedia page, I didn't know about this story about a member of the Rikers family. So before I get into that, I was reading about a timeline of when chattel slavery ended in New York, and there was a 1799 gradual emancipation law, which basically meant that currently enslaved people had to remain enslaved, but the children of enslaved mothers born after that law was passed would be freed. I have a lot of logistical questions about that, but I know that's not the focus here. So then, in 1817, there was another emancipation law that applied to people who were still enslaved, but it took effect in 1827. So it took a while to take effect, and even apparently, as late as 1830, there were still 75 enslaved people recorded in the census. So slavery really wasn't quite over even after 1827. And, while slavery in New York supposedly was supposed to end in 1827, there were loopholes. So even after 1827, if an enslaver was visiting New York for 9 months or fewer, they could bring enslaved people into New York, and that was legally fine, if they were visiting from out of state, which is pretty screwed up. Second, slave ships were allowed to anchor and restock in New York, as long as they weren't planning to sell any enslaved people within New York. There was even a court case in 1838 about it, which confirmed that a ship was allowed to do it in New York Harbor, as late as 1838. But I wouldn't be surprised if it also happened much later than that. Third, if you're American, I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the fugitive slave laws, which were really screwed up and which I vaguely remember learning about in school. So basically what could happen was agents representing Southern slave-owning plantation owners could come to New York, or states like New York, where slavery was illegal, and to read directly from the John Jay College website, they could kidnap Black persons resembling fugitives. Well, I obviously think it's screwed up that people were enslaved, period. And I think it's screwed up that enslaved people couldn't come to states where slavery was illegal and seek asylum there. But on top of all of that, enslavers from the South could come up to the North and they could just kidnap random Black people, claim that they resembled a fugitive enslaved person, which remember, this was the 19th century, and these were enslaved people. I'm sure there weren't photographs of these people where someone could be like, oh no, I have a picture of this person, I can prove they're this person. No, they would just find random people, claim they were someone who was enslaved in the South, and basically bring them back south and enslave them, and they could just spirit them away. But if they didn't want to just spirit them away, they could bring their victims to the Court of Special Sessions, which, to read again from the website, was presided over by former slaveholder Richard Reicher and his associates known as the Kidnapping Club. So, of course, I read that and I was like, yep, there's no way that's not one of the Newtown Reichers. So I went to Wikipedia. Of course, I saw that that was correct. He was the son of Samuel Reicher, a congressman, and Anna Lawrence Reicher of the Lawrence family. So Richard Reicher was a lawyer. He attended the College of New Jersey, which is now known as Princeton University. And he was a New York Assembly member and a district attorney. And so I'm going to just read a little bit from Wikipedia now. He served 3 non-consecutive terms as the Recorder of New York City between 1815 and 1838. In this position, Reicher abused the Fugitive Slave Act to send free blacks to the South to be sold into slavery. By the 1830s, abolitionists considered Reicher a member of the Kidnapping Club, along with Daniel D. Nash and Tobias Boudinot, who, quote, boasted that he could arrest and send any black to the South. So this is something that is scarier than any ghost story you could ever think of. This is completely horrifying, and there's a really good book about it that I'm actually reading right now. It came out last year. It's called The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street Slavery and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War, and it is written by Jonathan Daniel Wells. I'm listening to the audiobook of it right now. It's a good audiobook. I really recommend that you read it if you're interested in history at all. There's also a great excerpt of it from crimereads.com that tells the story of basically a 7-year-old boy named Henry Scott who was at school in Manhattan, and the classroom door opened and a Southerner and a New York sheriff walked in the room. They came to take Henry away, and basically they claimed that he belonged to this wealthy enslaver in the South, and they decided they were going to arrest Henry as a runaway. And this excerpt just tells the story of what happened to this boy, and I just want to read a little bit from this excerpt on crimereads.com. Reicher made his pro-Southern stance clear toward the end of one cold November day in 1836 when an alleged runaway was brought before him. An agent representing a Southern slave owner had claimed a fugitive and appeared before Reicher to make his case. The recorder had a message for the Southern agent. Tell your Southern citizens that we Northern judges damn the abolitionists. We are sworn to abide by the Constitution. Tell your Southern citizens that the great body of the Northern people are all right. As Reicher knew, the city teemed with pro-South and even pro-slavery Democrats, many of them Wall Street merchants, Irish laborers, members of Tammany Hall, and others who actively sought ways to entrap black residents in the web of the Kidnapping Club. Reicher unabashedly positioned himself near the center of the web. So then it talks about, more about this little boy, the 7-year-old boy, Henry. I'll read a little bit more. As a sobbing and terrified Henry sat before Reicher at the start of the hearing, it became quite clear that Reicher intended to live up to his reputation as the friend of Southern masters. Richard Haxall claimed that Henry actually belonged to his mother, Clara Haxall, that he had entered the courtroom to claim Henry on her behalf. New York law required that agents acting on behalf of owners had to present proof that they were official and documented representatives of the slave owner. But Haxall had no such proof. Reicher could have released Henry then and there, but instead, unsure about what course to take since he was convinced that Henry was in fact a fugitive, he ordered the young child to jail while Haxall was given time to produce his father's will. In the meantime, Henry's classmates had begun raising money for his legal defense. By gathering pennies from parents and the black community, the children in the city's public schools helped to release Henry from the clutches of the New York Kidnapping Club, one of the few to escape from the long and powerful reach of Boudinot, Nash, and Reicher. So again, the book is The Kidnapping Club by Jonathan Daniel Wells. It's really upsetting, but just a part of New York City history that I think should be more widely known. It's very interesting. And it just talks about how tons and tons of people who were born free in New York would be kidnapped and then brought to the South, and like no one would ever hear from them again. And that's just completely horrifying. And it also talks about people who had come to the North, basically for asylum from slavery and, ended up being kidnapped and brought back. And this all happened with the active and enthusiastic participation of Recorder Reicher, whose family was from Astoria. I wanted to read a little bit more about the story of this kidnapping club that Reicher was a part of. There was a really good, but of course extremely upsetting, article in Smithsonian Magazine called "The So-Called Kidnapping Club Featured Cops Selling Free Black New Yorkers into Slavery." And I really recommend that you read this article as well, whether or not you want to read the book, The Kidnapping Club. The article's good. And so to read a bit from that, the Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause required northern free cities like New York to return the self-emancipated to their southern enslavers, and the NYPD and officers like Renders were only too willing to comply, conveniently folding their hatred of black people into their reverence for the nation's founding document. Armed with the founders' compromise over slavery, Renders and his fellow officers, men like Tobias Boudinot and Daniel D. Nash, terrorized New York's black community from the 1830s up through the Civil War. And even worse, it often mattered little whether a black person was born free in New York or had in fact escaped bondage. The police, reinforced by judges like the notorious city recorder, Richard Reicher, sent the accused to southern plantations with little concern and often even less evidence. Thanks to Renders, Boudinot, and Nash, the New York Police Department had become an extension of the powerful reach of Southern slavery, and each month, and often each week in the summer months, brought news of another kidnapping or capture of a supposed runaway. Black New Yorker John Thomas, for example, was claimed by an enslaver from Louisville, Kentucky. Thomas purportedly fled slavery along the Ohio River, then traveled through Canada, and ultimately found a job as a porter in a Manhattan hotel. In late 1860, Thomas was arrested as a fugitive by the Manhattan police. While in prison, Thomas hastily drafted a note, dropped it out his cell window, and asked a passing boy to give the note to his employer, who submitted a writ of habeas corpus. Unfortunately, the marshal on duty was none other than Renders, who produced a different black man in response to the writ, and the judge declared the writ satisfied. In the meantime, Thomas's employer and friends learned, too late, that one of Renders' deputies had taken the real John Thomas to Richmond, where he would be transported to Kentucky, lost in the darkness of American slavery, like unknown numbers of other kidnapping victims. And the article also talks about what happened after the Civil War. Boudinot became a captain in one of the city's main wards, and Renders became a Democratic elder statesman during and after the war. In fact, New York City, always ready to defend the cotton trade with the South, voted against Lincoln in 1860 and harbored racial conservatives during and after the war. Embodied by newspapers like the New York Weekly Caucasian, one of the nation's most prominent promulgators of white supremacist ideology, the city remained an unfriendly place for African Americans. So we can leave it there for today. But between last week and this week, I think you've got a lot of context about the Reicher family and how much they did to harm people for hundreds of years. And their name now is still attached to, Reicher's Island, an infamously terrible prison in which 85% of people who've been imprisoned there haven't even been convicted of a crime, but in many cases just can't make bail and, end up spending years of their lives there because the right to a speedy trial is not necessarily something that people have heard of in certain parts of the city. So the Reicher's legacy is bad, and I will say there's nothing good about Reicher's Island and the prison, the penal colony there, basically. But I will say that I'm glad that the Reicher's name is sullied by being attached to such a terrible institution. I talk a lot about how it feels unfair that the names that are remembered, whether it's through our landmarks like, Hallett's Cove, or through our ghost stories. Like, last week I talked about a ghost that was supposedly the ghost of this member of the Hallett's family who was a slave owner, an enslaver. I get frustrated about the little people getting forgotten and the evil people getting commemorated, but there is some poetic justice, maybe? I don't know the right word for it. I'm glad that the Reicher family name is so inextricably tied to miscarriages of justice today, just as the Reicher family, owned human beings and helped kidnappers from the South enslave free people in the North. And, the Reichers thought this was the way things should be and the natural way of things. So screw the Reichers, screw Reicher's Island, read The Kidnapping Club. It's a very good book. And, what I read about the chains in the Reichers' basement makes a lot more sense in the context that I now have. So I will say it's been a little bit of a disappointment doing all this historical research of Astoria and Queens, this part of Queens, and realizing that most of the things that I love so much about this neighborhood are things that happened in the 20th century or later. And while I'm so fascinated still in the history of the neighborhood, it just feels like every time I find something and sink my teeth into it, it just ends up being kind of rotten and evil. So like I said, for the next episode, the week after next, I do expect to do some more traditional ghost stories. I say that now. I have a ton of ghost stories from newspaper sources that I pulled weeks ago, but I keep kind of like getting stuck researching one element of a ghost story and then finding such a wealth of information that's why this episode is like just about smugglers, smugglers' tunnels, smugglers' caves, etc. There's just so much there. And I'm sure that's true of anywhere where you do any local historical research, right? There's so much under the surface. But I hope you enjoyed today's episode, even though I know a lot of it was very upsetting. I also think it's like important context to have both for American history and the history of New York, which I think gets kind of freshened up and whitewashed, and a lot of people get to pat themselves on the back and say that New York was not involved in the slave trade, which couldn't be further from the truth. So thanks so much for listening. I'll be back the week after next with more Astoria ghost stories. In the meantime, you can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can check out the show notes at buriedsecretspodcast.com. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. And thanks so much for listening.